Some children grow up thinking they're broken, not because they were, but because they were told they were the problem. Maybe you remember this feeling. You'd walk into a room and the air would change, conversations would stop, eyes would turn. Not because you did something wrong in that moment, but because somehow, over time, you became the one everyone expected something to go wrong with. This video is about that child and about what happens when that story doesn't end in childhood. When people talk about childhood trauma, they usually picture obvious things: yelling, hitting, neglect. But there's another kind that hides in plain sight. It's quiet. It sounds reasonable. It even sounds logical. It's when a child isn't ignored and isn't abused in obvious ways, but is slowly taught that they are the source of tension, conflict, and stress in the family. This video is about the psychology of growing up as the problem and how that label quietly follows people into adulthood. Some families don't say you're the problem directly. They don't have to. The message gets through anyway. It shows up in patterns. Every argument somehow circles back to you. Every bad day becomes your fault. If a parent is stressed, you're too much. If a sibling is upset, you started it. If something goes wrong, people look at you first. Not because you did it, but because they expect you to. Over time, a child doesn't just hear these moments as separate events. Their brain connects them into a story. And that story is simple. When things go wrong, it's because of me. Children are meaning-making machines. They don't have the ability to say, "My parent is emotionally overwhelmed," or "This household doesn't know how to handle stress." They ask a much simpler question: what did I do wrong? And when that question doesn't get answered clearly, the child fills in the blank themselves. That's how the role forms. In psychology, this is sometimes called being the identified patient or the scapegoat. But those words can feel cold and technical. What it really means is this: the child becomes the emotional container for the family's unresolved tension. Instead of dealing with stress, conflict, or emotional immaturity, the system pushes it onto one person. And that person is usually the most sensitive, the most reactive, or the least protected. Not because they're weak, but because they're visible. If you were that child, you probably heard phrases like, "Why are you always like this?" Or "Why do you make everything so difficult?" Or maybe it was subtler. Eye rolls, sighs, long pauses before answering you. A tone that said, "Here we go again," before you even finished speaking. And slowly you learned something dangerous. You learned that your feelings cause problems, that your reactions make things worse, that your presence adds tension to the room. So you adapted. Maybe you tried to be quieter. Maybe you tried to be better. Maybe you became overly helpful, overly careful, overly aware of everyone else's mood. Or maybe you did the opposite. Acted out, got angry, leaned into the role that was already given to you. Either way, the label stuck. Here's the part most people don't talk about. Being treated as the problem doesn't just hurt in the moment. It changes how a child relates to reality itself. When you're constantly blamed, you stop trusting your own perception. If you say you're hurt and someone responds with, "You're overreacting," your brain doesn't just feel dismissed. It learns that your internal signals are unreliable. If you point out something unfair and you're told you're too sensitive, you start questioning whether your feelings make sense at all. Over time, the child stops asking, "Is this wrong?" and starts asking, "What's wrong with me?" That shift is subtle, but it's everything, because once that question takes root, it follows you everywhere. As an adult, you might notice it in small moments. You apologize before anyone accuses you. You explain yourself too much. You replay conversations in your head, looking for where you messed up. When conflict happens, your first instinct isn't to look at the situation. It's to look inward and assume fault, even when you're not at fault, even when you're being mistreated, even when you're right. This is one of the most painful parts of growing up as the problem. You don't just carry guilt, you carry a constant low-level suspicion of yourself, a feeling that says, if something feels off, it must be me. And here's the cruel irony. Many of the children who are treated as the problem are actually the ones reacting honestly to unhealthy environments. They're the ones who notice tension. They're the ones who feel the emotional undercurrent others are ignoring. They're the ones whose nervous systems are responding to instability in real time. But instead of being supported, they're labeled. Imagine a smoke alarm going off in a burning house. Instead of checking for fire, the family gets annoyed at the noise. Eventually, they decide the alarm is the problem, so they silence it. That's what happens to these children. They're not the fire, they're the alarm, but no one teaches them that, so they grow up believing they are defective, difficult, too much, a burden. And that belief doesn't disappear just because they become adults. It shows up in relationships. They attract partners who subtly blame them. They stay longer in situations where they're misunderstood. They second-guess their boundaries. They tolerate things they shouldn't because on some level they're still trying to prove they're not the problem. Workplaces can trigger it too. A small piece of feedback feels like confirmation of a lifelong fear. A misunderstanding spirals into shame. A neutral comment is interpreted as criticism, not because the person is weak, but because their nervous system learned early on that blame comes fast and safety comes late. At some point, many people reach a quiet breaking point. They realize they're exhausted, not from doing too much, but from constantly monitoring themselves, watching their tone, replaying their words, carrying responsibility for things that were never theirs to carry. This is usually when a deeper question surfaces. What if I was never the problem? That question can feel scary at first, because if you weren't the problem, then something else was. And facing that truth might mean seeing your childhood clearly, but without excuses, without minimizing, without protecting the people who didn't protect you. That's not easy. Many adults avoid this step because loyalty runs deep, because understanding the past doesn't always feel safe, because part of you might still believe that blaming yourself is easier than risking the truth. But here's what psychology shows us again and again. Children do not invent guilt out of nowhere. They absorb it. They inherit it. They carry what others refuse to face. If you were treated as the problem, it wasn't because you were inherently flawed. It was because someone else didn't know how to handle stress, emotion, or responsibility. And you became the place where it landed. Understanding this doesn't mean blaming your parents endlessly. It doesn't mean rewriting your life as a tragedy. It means updating the story your nervous system has been running for decades. A story that says, I am the cause. Healing begins when that story is gently questioned, not argued with, not forced away, just questioned. When something goes wrong and you feel that familiar spike of shame, pause. Ask, is this actually my responsibility? When someone is upset and your instinct is to fix it, ask, is this mine to carry? When your body reacts as if you're in trouble, remind yourself, this feeling is old, this moment is new. These small interruptions matter. They slowly teach the nervous system something it never learned as a child, that conflict doesn't automatically mean guilt, and emotion doesn't automatically mean danger. You're not erasing the past. You're teaching your body that it doesn't live there anymore. And maybe the most important thing to understand is this. Children who are treated as the problem often grow into adults with deep empathy, awareness, and emotional intelligence. Not because the experience was good, but because surviving it required them to read rooms, sense moods, and adapt quickly. Those skills can become strengths when they're no longer fueled by shame. The goal isn't to harden yourself, it's to stop punishing yourself for things that were never yours to fix. You were not born as the problem. You were placed there, and you don't have to stay there. If this felt familiar, you're not alone. And the next video on screen explores what happens when that label follows someone into adulthood long after the family story ends.